T.H. White's The Once and Future King is widely considered the most influential fantasy novel ever written. Drawn from Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, The Once and Future King's retelling of the Arthurian legend has been an inspiration for authors ranging from J.K. Rowling of Harry Potter to Lev Grossman, The Magicians, to Neil Gaiman, American Gods. T.H. White wrote only one great book, The Once and Future King, but the book was written over the course of decades and really encompasses several smaller novels fitted together with master craftsmanship. It's a funny novel, a political novel, a novel of romance and adventure, but most of all, it's a novel about the relationships between human beings and how they reconcile those relationships with eternal meaningful values, or whether the struggle and failure to do so is both the great human tragedy and the source of man's inherent dignity. Subscribe and click the bell for more high quality living and elegant style. Give this a like and stay until the end. This book will take you away from your world, so grab a cup of tea, get cozy. This is quite the compendium of multiple stories with one overarching narrative. I have my tea right here. A quick biography of T.H. White. Terence Hanbury White was born on May 29, 1906 in British-occupied India. His father worked with the Indian police and his mother was allegedly psychopathic, according to the biographer Sylvia Townsend Warner. He attended Cheltenham College in England and the Queen's College at Cambridge University, where he graduated with first-class honors, having written extensively on fellow English writer Thomas Malory. He wrote novels during summer vacations, but it wasn't until 1936 that he re-embraced the Malory legend. He wrote in his notes, "The whole Arthurian story is a regular Greek doom comparable to that of Orestes." He began work on the book that would become The Sword and the Stone, and that book made him an overnight success. As World War II approached, he wrote the second book, The Witch in the Wood, which would later be re-edited and retitled The Queen of Air and Darkness, and then The Ill-Made Knight, which is my personal favorite. Finally, in 1939, he completed The Candle in the Wind. He did write a fifth volume, The Book of Merlin, but his publisher essentially rejected it. Some editions of The Once and Future King now include it. In 1958, for the first time, the compendium known as The Once and Future King, which includes all volumes, and The Book of Merlin was published. 2 years later, Alan J. Lerner and Frederick Loewe, or it might be Frederick Lowe, creators of My Fair Lady, tried to turn the three books into Camelot, a musical which contains the multiplicity of beautiful songs, How to Handle a Woman and If I Ever Would Leave You among them, but little magic of the book, which has tons. White was widely characterized as peculiar. He lived alone, pursued hobbies including hunting and fish with alacrity, and rumored to be a homosexual and a sadomasochist in his personal life. He devoted himself to learning what Warner called techniques, adding it was a part of his theory about the Renaissance or Polytechnic man who could shoot and hunt a hare in the morning, fell a tree in the afternoon, and write a sonnet in the evening. If he saw an implement, plow, or paintbrush, he wanted to use it. If he watched a skill, to practice it, and having got what he wanted, went on to something else. He died at age 57, with the New York Times obituary quoting one reviewer who called White a modern exile in time longing for the past. If he had lived in his beloved past, he might well have been hanged as a warlock. The Sword in the Stone, Learning to be Human. The Sword in the Stone, which brought White to international prominence, has little connection to Malory. Malory's epic does not cover Arthur's youth. The Sword in the Stone posits Merlin as a guide for a young bastard named Wart, treated well by his guardian Sir Ector, but increasingly bad by his quasi-adopted brother Kay. It could be Kay or Kai, depending on where you're from. Merlin takes Wart under his wing and teaches him what he will need to know to become King of England and a hero of legend. Merlin doesn't want to bother versing Wart in religion or politics directly. He understands that the best teacher is experience, and he understands that children must be allowed to take risks so that they may grow. Merlin is no helicopter parent, quite the autonomous one. I will come, he tells Wart on his first foray into the natural world, but in future you will have to go by yourself. Education is experience, and the essence of experience is self-reliance. White describes the process of Wart's education in romantic, exciting terms. The Wart did not know what Merlin was talking about, but he did not like the grown-ups who talked down to him, but the ones who went on talking in their usual way, leaving him to leap along in their wake, jumping at meanings, guessing, clutching at known words, and chuckling at complicated jokes as they suddenly dawned. He had the glee of a porpoise, then pouring and leaping through the strange seas. As part of his education, Merlin turns Wart into various types of animals and then allows Wart to learn of the benefits and drawbacks of each. He first turns him into a fish. Wart is confronted with the grave threat of absolute monarchy by the pike. The great body, shadowy and almost invisible among the stems, ended in a face which had been ravaged by all passions of an absolute monarch, by cruelty, sorrow, age, pride, selfishness, loneliness, and thoughts too strong for individual brains. The king of the moat speaks only a few words. There is nothing except the power which you pretend to seek. Power to grind and power to digest, power to seek and power to find, power to await and power to claim. All power and pitilessness springing from the nape of the neck. Love is a trick paid on us by the forces of evolution. Pleasure is the bit laid down by the same. There is only power. Power is of the individual mind, but the mind's power is not enough. Power of the body decides everything in the end, and only might is right. The Pike's slogan, of course, will become everything Wart fights as King Arthur. Wart quickly realizes that pure physical might is not enough. It's not the only type of might. The power of the brain is greater. When he is transformed into a Merlin in order to learn from the hawks, he escapes the clutches of the insane and violent Colonel Cully by tricking him. Then Wart learns that the mind can be overcome too by the power of collectivism. His transformation into an ant teaches him the evils of totalitarianism. Everything not forbidden is compulsory. That slogan resonates in today's politics when we consider the general argument made by many that only the government has the sufficiently sublime wisdom to control our lives for our own sake. Among the ants, thought is obviated by the constant propaganda of song, the never-ending drumbeat of orders, the power of the hive mind, thanks to the lack of language to describe fundamental ideas like freedom and dignity or right and wrong. It also explained that Ant the father had ordained in wisdom that otherness pismires should always be the slaves of thisness ones. The ants are motivated by a series of self-contradictory arguments all held in common. Bart's education continues from Archimedes the owl. Pigeons are the best bird because they are loving individualists surviving against the forces of massacre only by wisdom in escape. Merlin knows because he lives time backwards that his quest to train a king to rectify the wrongs of the world is doomed to failure. Merlin has lived in the future already, but he still feels compelled to intervene in history, hoping that the tragic future can be changed anyway. Arthur is drawn into the same quest. Urged by all the animals, Wart draws the sword from the stone and becomes King Arthur. It's a triumphant moment, but it's also a tragic one. Wart has now embarked on the quest that will destroy him. The Queen of Air and Darkness, becoming a king. Arthur has become king, but he has not yet become legend. To become a legend, Arthur will have to apply the lessons of his youth to the task of ruling. He must both use power and deny himself the aphrodisiac. He must both pursue the right and remain open to learning that he is wrong. These are the tasks of leadership, both in myth and in reality. King Arthur begins his kingship with military victory, and he revels in it. He is chided by Merlin, who spits, "If there is one thing I can't stand, it is stupidity. I always say that stupidity is the sin against the Holy Ghost." In Merlin's view, Arthur has forgotten that battles are the glory of the elite, but the blood spilled of the peasants. Arthur learns the lessons. He later implements a rule for his knights that they ought to attack enemy nobles to press the war home to its real lords. Arthur must also learn war can nearly be justified by someone's claims against someone else's father. History, Merlin says, is an age-old story of victimization. Men need little excuse to battle one another. Merlin says if we go on living backward like that, we shall never come to the end of it. You should simply go on until you get to Cain and Abel. The destiny of man is to unite, not divide. If you keep on dividing, you end up with a collection of monkeys throwing nets at each other. There is only one good reason to fight. When you could be perfectly certain that the other man started them, you might have a sort of duty to stop him. Finally, at long last, he formulates his theory of rulership. In its first stage, might is not right. But there is a lot of might knocking about in this world, and something has to be done about it. Why can't you harness might so that it works for right? The might is there in the bad half of the people, and you can't neglect it. You can't cut it out, but you might be able to direct it, and if you see what I mean, so that it was useful instead of bad. My idea is that if we can win the battle in front of us and get a firm hold on the country, then I will institute a sort of order of chivalry. So the Knights of the Round Table is born. There is still one more lesson about war that Arthur must understand. Too much moral certainty, too much belief that one is undoubtedly right can also lead to the rule of might. Merlin responds with an anachronistic reference to Adolf Hitler. There was just a man, when I was young, an Austrian, who invented a new way of life and convinced himself that he was the chap to make it work. He tried to impose his reformation by the sword and plunged the civilized world into misery and chaos. But the thing which the fellow had overlooked, my friend, was that he had a predecessor in the reformation business called Jesus Christ. Perhaps we may assume that Jesus knew as much as the Austrian did about saving people, but the odd thing is that Jesus did not turn the disciples into stormtroopers, burn down the temple at Jerusalem, and fix blame on Pontius Pilate. On the contrary, he made it clear that the business of the philosopher was to make ideas available and not impose them on people. Liberty surely requires regularity and rule of law. It also requires humility in the application of force, or as philosopher and economist F.A. Hayek once observed, if we are to advance, we must leave room for a continuous revision of our present conceptions and ideals which will be necessitated by further experience. So King Arthur becomes ready to assume his legend. But there's only one problem. King Arthur is still a man, and because he is a man, he sows the seeds of his own downfall. He is seduced by his half-sister Queen Morgause, and she conceives a child, Mordred. King Arthur's creation and treatment of that child will lead in the end to the destruction of all his dreams. The Ill-Made Knight, the story of man, God, and sin. This is my favorite story. King Arthur may be the best king, but he is not the best man, not the holiest or the most reverent, not the most powerful or the most magnetic. That man is Lancelot. Lancelot is uniquely ugly, plagued by self-doubt. The song C'est moi from Lerner and Lou's Camelot is the most inaptly conceived song in the show and essentially destroys Lancelot's character. The boy thought there was something wrong with him. Even when he was a great man with the world at his feet, he was able to fill this gap. Something at the bottom of his heart which he was aware and ashamed, but which he did not understand. Where Arthur grew up carefree, tutored by Merlin, Lancelot grew up jousting and fighting. Where Arthur's fantasies were of transformation into fantastic beasts, Lancelot's dreams are of his desires thwarted. Lancelot is a man of honor. He has a word, as the ignorant country people still considered it to be the most valuable of possessions. His word was valuable to him not only because he was good, but also because he was bad. It's the bad people who need to have principles to restrain them.
It's very helpful for people to hear that they should make themselves competent and dangerous and take their proper place in the world.
Why dangerous?
Because it's the alternative to being weak. And weak is not good. The people who shoot up the high schools, they're weak.
How is it good to be dangerous?
Because it makes you formidable. And life is a very difficult process. You're not prepared for it unless you have the capacity to be dangerous. That doesn't mean that you should be cruel. It doesn't mean any of that. There's a statement in the New Testament, the meek shall inherit the earth. The meek isn't well translated. It means something more like, those who have swords and know how to use them but keep them sheathed will inherit the world. That's a way better way of thinking about it. You have to be powerful and formidable and then peaceful, in that order. And that's not the same as being naive and weak and harmless, which is what young men are being encouraged to be. That's a very bad idea, because naive, weak, and harmless means that you can't withstand the tragedies of life.
One reason why he fell in love with Guinevere was because the first thing he had done was to hurt her. Lancelot struggles to escape his love for Guinevere, fights battles, he attempts to maintain his honor, his word, and in that struggle he earns the title of hero. He battles the corrupt, the violent, he is more introspective than the usual knight, he's sorry in having to kill a criminal, violently ill after failing to execute a murderous husband. He is, in short, a man with a soul. Guinevere, by contrast, seems almost soulless. She struts and preens and complains. White is sympathetic to her, but not overly so, and this characterization of Guinevere does seem to mar the narrative. His only explanation of Guinevere's behavior is her age. At 22, the age of 30 seems to be the verge of senility. The marriage between her and Arthur had been what they had called a maid marriage. It had been a successful union, as maid marriages generally are, and before Lancelot came on the scene, the young girl had adored her famous husband. Even though he was so old, she felt everything except a passion of romance. Nonetheless, the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere, with the click of two magnets coming together, overwhelms them. It's Guinevere who overwhelms Lancelot, not truly the other way around. Lancelot struggles where Guinevere does not seem to. It's difficult to explain about Guinevere's love for two men at the same time. One reason for that dilemma was that he was a Christian. Another stumbling block to doing as he pleased was the very idea of chivalry or of civilization which Arthur had first invented and then introduced into his own young mind. Lancelot does resist. He continues to resist, but there is only one aspect of Lancelot's thinking that is completely lacking, and it is in this lack that the downfall is sown. Lancelot does not truly believe in forgiveness, at least not for himself, after he performs a miracle on Elaine and is falsely seduced by her through potions and enchantment. He weeps, believing that Elaine has stolen his might have derived from the rightness of virginity. When I was little, he explained to Elaine, I prayed to God that he would let me work a miracle. Only virgins can work miracles. I wanted to be the best knight in the world. I was ugly and lonely. People of your village said that I was the best knight of the world, and I did work my miracle when I got you out of the water. I did not know it would be my last miracle as well as my first. So believing that this capacity for saintliness is gone, Lancelot goes to Guinevere and begins his affair in earnest. Guinevere, for her part, enthusiastically embraces the affair. She prays for it. Lancelot gives up on himself forever, or so he thinks. He tells Guinevere, these were my dreams, Jenny. I am only telling you what I used to daydream about. They are what I mean by miracles, which are lost now. I have given you my hopes, Jenny, as a present from my love. Arthur, of course, knows that Lancelot and Guinevere are in love. We know little of Arthur's relationship with Guinevere. Their marriage was political, but filled with affection. But we know that Guinevere is far younger in spirit than Arthur, who's 8 years her senior. And Arthur looks the other way because he is forgiving and kind. Arthur was strong and gentle enough to hope that if he trusted Lancelot and Guinevere, things would come right in the end. It seemed to him that this was better than trying to bring them right at once by such courses as, for instance, by cutting off the lovers' heads for treason. Arthur is the only forgiving member of this triangle, and for this he pays the price. Guinevere is unforgiving about Lancelot's entanglement with Elaine. She drives him to madness, and Lancelot cannot forgive himself for his sins. He returns to court eventually and seems to sink into a status quo. Lancelot is offered the possibility of redemption. Possibility presents itself as the quest for the Holy Grail, quest designed by Arthur in order to rechannel his aggression of the knights away from their self-destructive pursuits. While there were still giants and dragons and wicked knights of the old brigade, we could keep them occupied, we could keep them in order, and when a moral sense begins to rot, it's worse than when you had none. I suppose that all endeavors which are directed to a purely worldly end, as my famous civilization was, contain within themselves the germs of their own corruption, and Lancelot finds redemption. He discovers that his pride in his own abilities to have foreclosed the possibility of something higher. He quests for the Holy Grail, his own son with Elaine, Sir Galahad finds it, and he rediscovers God. Of course, he must cut off his relationship with Guinevere, and he does so, but all is changed again when Guinevere is accused of murder. Arthur can do nothing to forestall the action, and instead sought rule and law and civil justice. Lancelot must step in and save Guinevere, and then save her again, as it turns out, when she is accused of adultery by Sir Meleagrance. The result is once again a new sort of status quo. It's a story of love in the old days when adults loved faithfully, not a story of the present, which adolescents pursue the ignoble spasms of the cinematograph. Lancelot had given his god to Guinevere, and she had given him his freedom in exchange. Arthur was inventing law as power. Nor had Arthur cause for private reproach. He had kept himself aloof. But there is one final note, and one final miracle, and as it turns out, one final tragedy. Lancelot is granted another miracle. He heals a man with an eternally bleeding wound. The miracle, White says, was that he had been allowed to do a miracle. In God's mercy, Lancelot's fate is sealed. He had been denied the miracle. Perhaps he might have been humiliated and turned once again from Guinevere to God. Had he been denied the miracle, perhaps he would have abandoned God altogether and absconded with Guinevere. Either possibility might have forestalled in the tragedy of Camelot. Instead, God, like Arthur, treats Lancelot with mercy, and in the process, fate is sealed. The Candle in the Wind, the tragedy of reality. The fourth part of The Once and Future King is the culmination of the tragedy. It's brought about by the simple fact that while individuals may be merciful, the law cannot be, and in the movement from barbarism to civilization, we can easily forget that civilization relies on the continuation of moral education. It's not sufficient unto itself. Arthur's journey has taken him from unlearned youth to national leader to founder of civil law. He has moved from might on behalf of right to might towards civil law and justice. It was the age of fullness, age of wading into everything up to the neck. Arthur was a patron saint of chivalry. He was the badge of everything that was good in the Middle Ages, and he had made these things himself. Only a man born in barbarism could have taken on the task of civilizing a nation. But the new system punishes the barbarism of old. Only a forgiving society, steeped in moral education, can understand that simple fact and allow for progress. But Mordred, driven by hatred, is incapable of forgiveness. Arthur's own son can never forgive his father for abandoning him to drown. Instead, sides with the original barbarism of his mother, channeled through the niceties of law and politics. It doesn't matter that Arthur regrets his deed, or that he refuses to use his power to kill Mordred. Mordred must have his revenge. Candle in the Wind begins with Mordred's half-brother Agravain, recognizing that if the Orkneys are to have their revenge, they can only do so by raising popular resistance to the chivalric idea. You need a national grievance, something to do with politics, which is waiting to burst out. We could say we were in favor of a national movement, we could join them together and call it national communism, but it has to be something broad and popular which everyone can feel. It must be against large numbers of people, like the Jews or the Normans or the Saxons, so that everybody can be angry. Agravain knows that in order for this movement to succeed, there must be a break in the power of Arthur's administration. That break can take place over Lancelot and Guinevere. Then, Agravain says, would be the time to take your famous revenge. Mordred takes advantage because he had found himself misshapen, critical in a civilization which was too straightforward for purely intellectual criticism. Mordred stands on the same moral high ground that those who destroy always stand on, the moral high ground of consistency. He argues to his brothers that to expose Lancelot and Guinevere, to subject Arthur to the trial, is necessary in order to fight hypocrisy. I may be a weak knight at jousting, he tells Gawain, but I have the courage to stand for my family and rights. I am not a hypocrite, but of course Mordred isn't standing for the code of chivalry or love of justice. He is seeking to destroy them, suggesting that it's better that a correct code filled with exceptions be leveled than that it exists in the first place. Only those who wish to uphold an institution have the moral wherewithal to challenge its hypocrisy. Those who wish to destroy the institution are merely looking for the most handy brickbat available. Arthur, for his part, despises his own sin. He vows that he will not be a part to such sin ever again, even if it means dispensing with mercy. You must remember, I am the King of England. If I don't stand for law, I won't have law among my people. I have to be absolutely just. The only way I can keep clear of force is by justice. Far from being willing to execute his enemies, a real king must be willing to execute his friends. He's not been put to the test, though, and Mordred puts him to the test, aided and abetted by the foolish complacency of Lancelot and Guinevere, who, though warned, insist on risking the fate of the kingdom for just another evening together. Arthur sees Mordred's test as historic vengeance for his own sin. When I was a young man, I did something which was not just. From it has sprung the misery of my life. Do you think you can stop the consequences of bad action by doing good ones afterwards? I have been trying to stop it down with good actions ever since, but it goes on widening circles. In the end, crisis is nearly averted. Guinevere, though, sentenced to death, is rescued by Lancelot, but in the process, Lancelot kills Gawain's brothers, Gareth and Gaheris, neither of whom was involved in Mordred's scheme, and Mordred quickly moves to motivate his brother Gawain, Arthur's last true ally, in vengeance against Lancelot. Even after Guinevere is returned to Arthur by order of the Pope, and Lancelot is exiled, Gawain must follow him to pursue his vengeance. Mordred then declares Arthur dead and himself a king. He attempts to marry Guinevere himself. Justice, he boldly proclaims, has never been his aim, only vengeance. Arthur must come to grips with his own sin. He either had to choose fulsome justice, which would have meant the deaths of Guinevere and Lancelot, or fulsome power, which would have meant the killing of Mordred. He chose neither, and so ended with a split kingdom, unable to solve the riddle of human existence, because so many of man's schemes depend on the possibility of human change, and for nearly everyone such change is extraordinarily difficult. As Arthur notes, he had been taught by Merlin to believe that man was perfectible, that he was on the whole more decent than beastly, good was worth trying, that there was no such thing as original sin. He had forged as a weapon for the aid of man on the assumption that men were good, might to have ended it, to have made men happier, but the whole structure depended on the first premise, that man was decent. If there was such a thing as original sin, if man was on the whole as a villain, if the Bible was right in saying that the heart of man was deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, then the purpose of his life had been a vain one. Chivalry and justice became child's illusions, but of course the reality of original sin doesn't damn man to eternal failure. The quest is not in vain. The quest remains a quest. Man's flaws do not obviate the pursuit of right. In the end, White, a man of the rational, puts his faith in reason. If people could be persuaded to read and write, not just to eat and make love, there was still a chance that they might come to reason. T.H. White did write a fifth book, the Book of Merlin. It was only published years after The Once and Future King. It's deeply flawed, just Merlin lecturing Arthur about politics and power by transforming him again into animals. But the last chapter spells out the fates of the various characters. Arthur and Mordred divide England, which prompts a soldier of Mordred's to draw his sword, precipitating a battle, which Mordred is killed. Lancelot ends up in a monastery and Guinevere in a nunnery. Arthur's fate remains unknown. If legend holds true, he will return again and bring with him the glory of justice and the power of right. I will have some study questions you can answer in the full blog post linked below with more detail, and would love to know your thoughts on The Once and Future King in the comments. Every month we have a new book. I have the full list of books for the year linked below. You can download for free, and you can also find the book for yourself linked below, or if you already own it, wonderful. Sometimes I like to know what happens but still go back and study such magnificent works nonetheless. These are behemoths that you can tear into over and over again and always learn something new. Subscribe and click the bell for more high quality living and elegant style. Give this a like, and thank you so much for watching.